Hi, my name is Berlin Fan, and I would like to talk to you a little bit about Journey to the West by Wu Cheng. And first of all, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the Chinese literary traditions. It is very hard to do because there are so many years of heritage in there. But generally speaking, Chinese literature, the earliest form is usually classical prose from the years of the spring, autumn, or warring state. That's a lot of years before Christ, and in those years, most of the writing are in the prose format, but of course there are also poetry. But these prose formats have lots of philosophical writings. So we used to have a very um, prosperous period for philosophers. We call this period a period of 100 schools of thought. In Chinese poetry, there's not one word for poem or poetry. There are actually several words for poetry, depending on its form. There are poetry of set length, poetry of varied length, and some poems go by templates, and there is also musical poetry, and there is rhymed prose, which can be thought of as poetry as well. And then many dynasties in China are characterized by a specific literary genre. For instance, the Yuan dynasty, when China was ruled by the Mongolians, one of the predominant form of literature is operas. And in the Tang dynasty and Song dynasty, when the Chinese is at its peak of its development, especially Tang dynasty, there is a lot of prose form which coexist with one of the greatest one of the greatest poetry developments in China as well. In the Ming Dynasty and Qing Dynasty, which is closer to us, we have novels. And since 1911, since the Republic of China was founded, there's a lot of translated literature from the West. So lots of philosophers and novels were translated into Chinese. But of course, that also started a little bit towards the end of the Qing Dynasty. And now we have the People's Republic of China, and literature here during that period was less known until recently when Mo Yan won the Nobel Prize, because for a long time the People's Republic of China was separated from the rest of the world until the late 1970s. Recent years, as China gained in importance on world stage, its literature is also being more and more paid attention to. Now let's talk a little bit about Chinese novels. Every Chinese, whether they're well read or not, know these four novels. They are called 四大名著, four great classics. And they are Journey to the West, which we are going to talk about today, and All Men Are Brothers. It's a story about outlaws, which is fascinating. And Per Buck translated this novel into English, which you can still find today in Amazon. And then there is a story called Romance of Three Kingdoms. It is about a period of time in China in the 200s of AD, I believe, when three kingdoms are fighting with each other, or sometimes they form allies, sometimes they fought with each other, and all the stories that derive from that. It's a story about wars, strategies, friendship, and alliances, or all sorts of things that related to this. And then we have A Dream of the Red Mansions. That is the novel set in the Qing Dynasty. It's one of the most recent ones of the four classics. The Dream of Red Mansions talks about the decline of a noble family in the Qing Dynasty. It is still being translated today, and it's still being read very widely by Chinese at different school levels. Journey to the West was written by Wu Cheng'en, born 1501 and died 1582. He lived to a ripe old age for a person at his time. He was raised in Jiangsu province, which was quite prosperous nowadays. And his dad actually was from my hometown, Tongcheng, in Anhui province. Wu Cheng'en, when he was a child, was a ferocious reader. He was reading all sorts of things, especially the novels in the Tang Dynasty, which fascinated him. In those days in China, there's not much a student can do other than passing the royal court and become an official. In the end, Wu Cheng'en was never successful in becoming an official, so he didn't advance very far in his academic or bureaucratic career. However, he spent his time writing a novel, which was not the most admired thing to do at that time. For a long time, he published the Journey to the West anonymously, and not even putting his name on the novel, because he was not feeling honored by having written a novel like this, although it is treated as one of the greatest classics in the Chinese literary history. The authorship was found, I believe, in the 20th century, and he was established as the author of this novel. This novel was set in the Tang Dynasty, when China was at its peak of development. The capital city of the Tang Dynasty was Chang'an. That is like the intellectual capital as well for the world at that time. People from all over the world came to Chang'an to study Chinese culture. And also people from all over the world try to bring its influences upon the Tang Dynasty, upon the emperors and the citizens at that time. Christianity actually spread out to China during that time as well as Buddhism. Journey to the West was based on the true story of how a Buddhist monk in China at that time went to India to bring lots of Buddhist scriptures to China, so that Buddhism started to take root in China. And as you can see from the dashed arrow, these are the routes that the monk took to go to India to bring back the scriptures. It's a long and arduous journey. Actually, the monk went there, I think, not one time. It is a very difficult journey as well, because in those days you have to either walk or ride a horse to go there, and the journey can be very, very long, even by today's standards, not to mention in those days. And he has to go through very difficult landscapes, such as deserts and mountains with snow, etc. This is a picture of the monk. Xianzang is his Chinese name, his Buddhist name. His real name is surname is Chen. He actually, as you can see from this picture, almost hiked all his way like a backpacker, because he's carrying lots of load for his survival as well. The load also contains Buddhist scriptures he's carrying all the way through. So he was a tough living monk who has a mission, who was very driven to bring the scriptures to China, and then to translate the scriptures into Chinese, so that more people can know what he believes is the truth from Buddha. The second most notable figure, actually some argue that he may be the most notable figure in the novel, is the Monkey King, or called the monkey in some translations, or Sun Wukong is what is known to many in Chinese. That is his Buddhist name. He was one of the most capable figures in the novel. He's a main fighter with the monster, and he also kind of a leader, a peer leader among the other disciples. He sometimes disciplines the other two disciples, or teach them. He is also capable of 72 transformation. That means he can transform himself into 72 additional forms. He can just turn into a bee, for instance, a bug or frog, or something along those lines. if that helps him to deceive the enemies that he is fighting. And then you have Ba Jie, or the pig. His name means a lot to the Chinese. Ba Jie. Ba means eight. Jie means do not do something. Avoid. Eight avoidances. Basically, his name is derived from the Buddhist sayings about the things you should be cautious about, such as you should be cautious about. You should not kill. You should not steal. You should not have lust. You should not lie. You should not drink. You should not have excessive makeup and apparel. You should not sit and lie in big beds, very specific at times. Ironically, in the novel, Ba Jie embodies many of these vices. So he actually is an embodiment of human sins of a sort, according to Buddhist understanding, which, by the way, sometimes overlap what the Christian traditions also say. The last figure, probably the least interesting figure in the novel, is the sand monk, or Friar Sand, or the eel. He originally was a eel turned into a Buddhist disciple. He was the person that is capable of only 18 transformation, while Ba Jie, the pig, is 36, and if you remember, the monkey is 72, so they go down in their capabilities. The sand is not as capable fighter or a disciple as the other two, so he carries a lot of load when they are traveling. Then the horse is also treated as a figure in the novel. The horse is also called White Dragon Horse. The horse has some deified capabilities too, but the novel didn't seem to pay too much attention to this horse, other than being a horse that the monk is riding. Here is a quick synopsis of the story. The story is divided into 100 chapters, and at the beginning it's like a 3,000-mile view from up high about the origin of the universe. There is a creation story, which sometimes reminds me of the Garden of Eden story in the Bible as well. And there is a story about rebellion and subjugation, especially about the monkey and his starts and how he rebels against the heavenly court, and he was then punished by that until he was saved by the monk. And then the story is mostly centered upon the pilgrimage to the West to get the Buddhist scriptures, when the monks gradually gathered his disciples one at a time, and the discipleship starts to form. And when they are traveling together to the West, there are all sorts of trials and tribulations, which may echo memories of the trials and tribulations the real monk in history, experienced while he was hiking to India from Chang'an, today's Xi'an, city of Xi'an, because he has to go through all these difficult mountains and rivers and deserts, things like that. And there's lots of misunderstandings between the monk, the master, and the disciples, and among the disciples themselves, and how the disciples misunderstood something, or they were misunderstood by the master, and how that kind of dynamic gets resolved in the end. So there's a lot of stories about that as well. But mostly they as a team are fighting with various sorts of monsters, and these monsters eventually are defeated by either the disciples themselves, or they got help from heaven, from up above, from the heavenly court, heavenly generals, or the other Buddhist figures at that time that came to their rescue. And then toward the end, there's a salvation story. They eventually got to the West, quote unquote West, and they got the scriptures, they meet the gods, and they turn immortal. All of them turn immortal. So immortality in this story is a result of their learning because they went through this journey, they discovered something about the world, they got the scriptures, they translate the scriptures, they learn the scriptures, they learn. As a result, is they become immortal. So it is very fascinating a story for me personally because I'm an instructional designer. I'm more about human learning, and I've never read another novel that says by learning something you become immortal. Maybe we can. This novel was popular in China. It is one of the most popular novels in China and the most popular among the four classics by far. Because it is so much work derived from this novel. There are TV episodes from this novel based on this novel. There are movies. There are cartoon books. There are operas, all sorts of things. And the man on the left that you see is Liu Xiaolingtong. He's a Beijing opera player, and eventually he turned his entire career playing the monkey. And he is known as being associated with the monkey all his life. Legend has it that when he goes to a scenic spot where there are lots of monkeys and he's dressed in this fashion, in the Monkey King fashion, he salutes to the monkey and the monkey even salutes back to him. And works continue to be created based on this novel, such as this Monkey King Hero is Back movie that was produced not long ago, and it was quite popular. You probably can find it on Netflix or something like that. There are also alternative adaptations, by which I mean work that are only loosely based on the story, but it's recreations of the story in other traditions, such as this postmodernist adaptation of the novel called 大话西游, which was produced in Hong Kong. I think it's in 1990s. It was very popular at that time. All of us can recite passages from this movie, even today. And if you want to meet a Chinese millennial mentioning this movie, 大话西游, actually will help because you can connect to this novel, especially how it depicts the monk, the monkey, etc. It's kind of hilarious a movie because, for instance, the monk who used to be a saintly figure, high and mighty, and in this movie it became a kind of nagging figure, and the monkey should be a Buddhist monkey that should not have women in his life. In this novel, it is depicted as someone who almost falls in love with a girl. So that is also fairly interesting. So basically, it twisted the original plot and to give it some kind of a postmodernist interpretations to it. The Chinese do not see the novel simply as a novel. There's a lot of thinking based on this novel. For instance, the disciples and the monks are believed to be representing personality types, just like Enneagram or other personality type schemes in America. For instance, the monkey represents people who are the leaders in a team, who are doing a lot of work, who are often misunderstood, but who also take an active role when there's a task facing him. The pig represent the team members who are after their own desires, things like that. And there's also interpretation of novel that sees the wants and needs for all the disciples and the monk as the hierarchies of human needs. For instance, the monkey is after self-fulfillment and achievement. The pig is after lust and physical needs. and food, things like that. And the monkey has higher needs for spiritual salvation. And this story also gives the Chinese people, or represent the Chinese understanding of heaven and hell, what that's supposed to be like. Of course, that's an imaginative depiction of the dichotomy. And then there are stories about the rule and rebel, which is a very sensitive topic in the Chinese literature, because the emperors always want people to be obedient, and they want to have order. And the Confucian tradition also emphasize, you should have order. You should let the capable rule, or you should let the elders rule. You should listen to the authorities, things like that. And then, but this novel also tells you a lot about stories about rebellion. That's probably because Wu Cheng'en, the author, he is not one main official figure in the royal court. He is just some guy there writing novels in his free time, which he has a lot of. So that's possibly why this story talks so much about rule and rebellion, and does not make rebellion sound so bad. And then there's a lot of depiction about peace and violence in this novel as well. How peace is achieved, how violence gets resolved, and this represents a lot of the Chinese understanding of these concepts. The story appeals to the Chinese audience for many reasons. It's like the Narnia or the Odyssey for the Chinese, because lots of stories can be based upon it, as we have discussed a little bit earlier, and it's also become the prototype for many other stories. And it has very vivid characters, and that is kind of new for the Chinese literature. Not that I'm saying that there in the past we don't have vivid characters, but novel was not an important form of literature in those in classic Chinese literature. But reading this novel, you see that it's so much possible to create vivid characters in a literary form. And then there's a lot of there's a lot of religious connotations or context in this novel, because there is Buddhism, there is Taoism, and there is Confucianism. So all of these elements are mixed in this novel. Sometimes there are conflicts between the Buddhists and the Taoists, for instance, in this novel, which is also fairly interesting, because it gives you an idea how the different religious traditions clash with each other in the Chinese history. And there are a lot of folk traditions being depicted in the novel, and there are stories in the novel, but there's also a lot of poetry in the novel as well, which appeals to the Chinese, which some of which we can still remember. However, it may get lost in translation, because the Chinese poems are highly, how do I call it? It is very rigid in terms of its rhymes and rhythms, and there are templates. So they write according to these templates, and there are certain ways you should end the poem, like the iambic pentameter in the English poetry, which gets very difficult to translate into another language. So some of this is lost in the translation that you might be reading. And pop culture also make this novel very appealing to the Chinese, because year after year there are additional works to be made from this novel, which is fascinating to me. As a Chinese, I am very interested in finding out how this novel is received abroad. I know that it's not very well read in the West, because some of the topics are very alien or very exotic, and some of the concepts are hard to understand without the proper context. So I am very interested in finding out what you think about it after you are required to read this novel, in a sense. So how do you perceive this novel? So which stories do you find hard to follow? If you have watched any movies, does it make it easier for you to understand what the stories in this novel are about? what you like or dislike about it, and what do you think of the translation, and things like that. I'm really interested in hearing more from you about this novel or the excerpts that you have read. Um, I'm showing one contrast between the Chinese version in its original as well as the English translation. As you can see, there are certain parts of the um, Chinese version that are at the beginning. There's a poetry at the beginning, and then it mentions the Chinese concept of time. I do not know how well this can be perceived in the West, but to me it's quite clear the concept of time, because we still use this references of time even today. Uh, some of us do, and the poetry form may be lost a little bit in the translation, but still it's a good story if you continue to read the story. There are lots of references and resources on the internet about this novel. Some of these are well worth reading. The translation, there are several translations: Jenner's translation, Whaley's translation, and then there's Anthony Yu's translation, which is gaining popularity. Anthony Yu is a university, I believe, from the University of Chicago, and his translation was highly praised when it came out. So go check them out and see whether it provides additional understanding about this novel, which has fascinated the Chinese for centuries now.